No, you don't understand. He's on for hours and hours and hours at a time. And I said, but his lips are flanged like the fishy, like I read in the book. And she goes, I really think you need to see our IBCLC that's here in the office.
Balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Episode number 169. Welcome to All About Breastfeeding, the place where the girls hang out. I am your host, Lori Jill Eisenstadt, IBCLC, and I help moms with breastfeeding. You know how I love getting feedback and learning what it is that you want to hear more of. You have been asking to hear more from moms who have tandem nursed. I put feelers out to talk to moms who had varying degrees of breastfeeding experiences and who tandem nursed, and I asked you to contact me. Well, my guest today answered my call, and we are lucky to have her share her breastfeeding journey with 4 children with us today. She had a difficult first birth and a difficult breastfeeding beginning with her first baby boy. She was cracked and bleeding and exhausted. We find out how she got the support she needed, how this led her on a path to becoming an IBCLC, as well as her interest in tandem nursing. Now, I know many of you are driving while listening to the show, or exercising, or otherwise doing some other occupied task. If you are home, though, pour yourself something to drink and take a seat and sit back and relax. Talking with Jenn is just like sitting across the kitchen table, chatting away with an old friend. Nice, comfy, familiar, and relaxing. Here we go. Jenn Foster, IBCLC, and Master's Student in Lactation Consultant is with us today. She is a mother of 4 children, 13, 11, 3, and a 7-month-old. She tandem nursed through her 4th pregnancy with her now 3-year-old, and I would like to thank Jenn so much for giving her time with such a busy life with kids to be able to share some of her breastfeeding journey with us. So welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, Jenn.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Thank you. And what I would like to know, what I'd like to start off with is by you just sharing a little bit about the life that you lived and where you grew up and kind of what life was like for you as a little kid.
Sure. Well, I am born and raised in the Central Florida area, which is quite unique nowadays. I come from a household of divorced parents, so I lived in 2 very different worlds. One side with my father was a very religious household, and the other with my mother was more of a diversified atmosphere and lifestyles and experiences. But with that being said, we had a wonderful childhood. I was never exposed to anybody breastfeeding, though, that I remember. But it was a great childhood. I have an older sister, a younger brother, and 3 stepsisters growing up, and so it was just a great childhood.
What was that like going back and forth between 2 households? What really stood out for me was that one was a little bit more, sounds like quite a bit more laid back, and another a more religious household. So did you just adjust to, I'm in this household now, I act and we do a certain thing, and then I'm in this household and there's a little bit more leeway?
I laugh because it was very much a juggle. With our father, it was only skirts, no pants, no shorts, no movies, no TV or radio, church 3 times a week. And then with our mother, it was very much more liberal. Just express yourself, let's experience all religions and cultures and lifestyles. And so it was 2 very, very different ends of the spectrum. So, we learned to adapt out of reverence and respect for our parents. in terms of which environment we were in at the time. But I truly feel like it allowed us to really see both ends of the spectrum and everything in between to really make us more well-rounded individuals as we grew up.
Yeah, I agree. It's like the earlier you are when you're exposed to different languages and cultures, really,
Yes.
the better off that you are, rather than live in a very middle class white neighborhood of everybody of the same religion, and you're there till you're 18 years old. You definitely, most people I would say, would develop a certain way of looking and seeing and being in the world, rather than if you grew up in a very multicultural big city for the first 18 years of your life. Not that someone would not be open-minded, but I think if you're just living that lifestyle every single day, you only know what you see.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're absolutely correct. And looking at the question that you proposed there and that scenario that you indicated, it really thinking back on it, I truly do feel fortunate to be able to have those different perspectives in different households. You just gain so much personally, and then that can carry in, to your professional life and your later family life as to what you want to implement and what you don't want to implement with your own children. And it really, provides a different perspective, and appreciation of just life and culture and religion and different lifestyles and everything in between.
Yeah, and also you used a very good word that you adapted, and how wonderful it is. Really, I mean, how wonderful it is to be able to be put in that position, that you do learn how to adapt to different people and lifestyles much earlier on. So that was all working your benefit.
Absolutely.
Before you mentioned, and I never really saw anybody breastfeeding, and I actually never did either. And I did a lot of babysitting when I became an IBCLC or started studying it. And I started to think about, who else did I actually even see breastfeed? Because as a young mother breastfeeding my first, I never had any peers. But at that time, I never really thought about what I grew up with. And it wasn't until I was studying that I started to think, well, who did I grow up with? And I started to really think, and rack my brain, did any of the many, many, many mothers that I babysat for, and I babysat for a lot of women for many years. And I really started to think, and I'm like, no, not unless I don't remember or they hid it away in a room. But no, I remember bottle feeding babies with the milk and putting cereal in the bottles in those days. And
oh my goodness.
it was very common, rice cereal in the bottles. And so, no, all my growing up, I never even saw anybody breastfeed.
That's so interesting that you say that, even the babysitting aspect, because I babysat a lot, and I'm sitting here thinking that, quite honestly, even if it was an extended period of time, I don't ever recall, seeing any, breast pumps or any sort of, milk that now we would know to resemble breast milk. It was always, preparing formula bottles and having a set schedule and going to bed at a certain time in a certain way. A lot of sleep training that I had when I was babysitting. None of my peers, I never breastfed when I had my first. And, nobody in my family, I never noticed anybody in my family, nobody talked about it or, had any experience. It was just, a lot of bottle feeding. So, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of bottle feeding. It's always interesting to me. It's way too many years to me, so I just cannot remember anymore. But I wish I could actually remember how I decided that I wanted to breastfeed, because it certainly wasn't part of the family I grew up in, the culture, the environment, and I was the first one to have a baby. Maybe I saw it in a magazine or something at that point, but still, how I thought that, I'm going to breastfeed when nobody else in my world did.
So you set the path.
Oh boy, did I.
I can relate to that.
Well, I always say, we only know as good as we know and we're taught. And my mother grew up in an era as a young mother that she was given a pill to dry her up. And not only that, talked about, people would talk about, in cows, yeah, why would you even want to do that? And the breastfeeding rates were probably between 20 and 25%. So it was pretty foreign to her. So she formula fed all of her five. Her sister-in-law's formula fed. All the neighbors, everybody formula fed. It wasn't anything different. And then the next generation, when my sister had her first two, she formula fed. So when you say I paved a new path, yeah, I was definitely paving a new path because nobody knew from nothing from a breastfeeding mom. So they got a whole lot of education from me.
Yeah, I can certainly relate because, when I had my first, my parents and my family had no way, they did not know how to react to this fact that, I lifted my shirt and fed my baby at my breast. It was, oh my goodness, well, you have to go to your car for that. Or, oh, you have to go to the back room, like that's indecent. So I can completely relate to setting that path.
Yeah, well, I remember both of the grandparents that were like, well, how am I going to babysit? And it was like, oh, so what are we going to do when she stays over? And I'm like, well, I have no idea how to answer any of those questions, but I can tell you she's not staying overnight. Like, I couldn't even fathom that, but that was the expectation. And then the next thought was, well, how are we going to feed her if the boobs aren't here?
Right.
Little did they know that they didn't get their granddaughter overnight for quite a few years.
Oh.
They didn't realize that was happening. They probably, I know that they expected to have a grandbaby sleeping over their house in the very, very early weeks and months, and that didn't happen for them.
Yeah, same here.
Same here, yeah. Lots in common. Tell me a little bit about when you were a young girl, and you had so much incredibly wonderful exposure. But is there something that you thought that you would be doing with the rest of your life that you had dreamed of, and then compare that to what you are doing now?
Oh, wow. Well, when I was young, it reminds me a lot of how my 3-year-old is now. I mean, I loved to sing and I was very expressive. But as I got more into adolescence and in high school, politics just really drew me in. All throughout high school and college, I was in, debate team and Model United Nations and political organizations. My college major was originally political science and international relations. I even was an intern for John Micah in Washington, D.C. for a full summer. That was just my vision. I wanted to be in politics. I wanted to create change. But after the birth of our first son, everything just completely changed. I had a very, very long traumatic birth experience that I had no help with breastfeeding. Again, kind of like what you were saying, I guess the only thing that really prompted me to breastfeed was just from what I had read, that it was the best, and I was determined to do it. But, it was very difficult with him at first. And, once I realized that there's professionals out there that, could help make breastfeeding experiences more successful, that was my passion, and that was my new drive. And so that's really what just changed my path completely, was really focusing on how I can become that lactation professional and really help other mothers and babies have a more successful, positive breastfeeding experience.
How shocked were you in that change after you had your first baby, as far as your career, and a big, big, big switcheroo, different shift in the mindset once you had your first baby?
Oh, goodness gracious. I'm trying to think back now. He's 13. I don't know that shock would be a word that I would describe to it. It was more so, I was always very passionate about creating change, in the United States, in my community, in the world. And I think I just refocused that passion to creating change in the realm of lactation, breastfeeding, and birth. So it almost just seemed like kind of just redirecting my energy, my passion. It certainly was a shock to my family more so, because they were always like, well, what in the world? We just always imagined you to be a politician in D.C. or a mayor or something. That passion is still there, just geared towards, a different purpose.
It's funny. I have to remind myself actually to not use that word shock. That was my personal experience. And I find that sometimes I take my personal experience and I forget that that's not everybody's experience and I use that term shock when we're talking about, having some pretty clear ideas of what it is we think we're going to do. We have no aspirations to necessarily be a stay-at-home mom and totally change direction. I thought I would be home for 6 or 8 weeks and then go back to work and carry on a career and, all that stuff. And so that's why it was just shocking when it all shifted, because for me, it was like night and day. And it was like, I remember when my husband started to ask about daycare, I'm like, my story is for what? Well, for the baby. When you go back to work, I'm like, I'm not going back to work. Like, what are you, crazy? Who's going to watch her?
Aww.
Yeah, my thing, it shocked me, and it totally shocked everybody else. And we all warmed up to it, got used to it, and everybody was cool with it. But just that change in the whole mindset was definitely a shock. So, but I always have to remember that's not everybody else's experience, and I forget that.
Well, to be honest, it's a shocking experience to become a mother, period.
Yes.
Because your expectations are completely different than reality. And, just the shock factor of, okay, I used to have this belly and I could control this baby because it was here. And I could, use the restroom on my own, or I could go to the grocery store. But now there is that shock factor of, wait a minute, I'm on this baby schedule now. I might have to be nursing while I go use the restroom, or whatever the case is. So I can certainly appreciate, still utilizing the word shock, because there ultimately is a lot of shock factors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I work with many women who talk about their experience, and it is, for I think a lot of people, they may not use the word shock, but it is a shock. And I worked with a woman a couple of months ago, and she described it as being shell shocked. She literally used those words. And I think a lot of people can relate, just the transition from whatever your life was like before to now becoming a mother, being responsible for a baby up 24/7. Your whole life is like topsy-turvy. And it's not to say one's right or wrong, good or bad, but it is, like you said, a bit of a shocker for some of us. And I remember my first reality in that, also feeling shocked. You mentioned something about using the bathroom or going and doing something. Is like, I remember the first time when I put my hand I had my keys in my pocket with my hand, and I put my hand on the door, and I literally opened up the door. And then as soon as I opened up the door, I said, oh, blankety blank, I have the baby. I can't just leave. She was 9 or 10 days old, so it wasn't like it was months later. But what I was actually going to do was go to the nearest store and get the newspaper, because we didn't get it delivered. And I had a habit every day of, going and picking up the paper. And that's really what my mindset was. I was going to take my pocketbook and go. But, oh, you just can't. And I decided not to do that day. That was just too overwhelming.
I can appreciate that.
Put her in the car seat. After a while, that becomes a no-brainer, but that early on, it was just too much for me to think about.
Absolutely. I understand.
So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your breastfeeding experience. And I think when you have a couple of kids, it's always helpful to at least start with the first and tell us some of the things that you did to prepare for breastfeeding, as far as attending a class, hanging out with our Leche League moms, other moms who you found a group that was breastfeeding, or read books or videos. So what are some of the things that you did to prepare?
Well, with my first, quite honestly, it was a pretty isolating experience being pregnant. It wasn't, a very welcomed factor within the family or friends spheres. So I honestly just, I was in school full time and I was working full time. So I just read a lot of books. And that was my only point of reference with my first child, was just that. And after he was born, I called all the hotlines for help and that sort of thing. Now, after my second was born, I had that previous breastfeeding experience to be able to go off of. But at that point was when I found out that WIC had breastfeeding support groups. And that was very helpful to me, to be able to go and be around other mothers that were going through similar circumstances and answering, having questions answered. And I really didn't learn about La Leche League until my second was, probably about 5 months old or so. And at that time I had gone through, to be a WIC breastfeeding peer counselor, and we were attending La Leche League conferences and that sort of thing. So, now it's more or less telling other mothers, oh, there's all these options out there to get prepared and have support. Every breastfeeding experience is so very, very different. And I think that's something that I've learned breastfeeding the 4 children that we have, is that every experience is very different. So just because you've breastfed one doesn't mean that you know everything you need to know for the next one. With the first, it was just reading a lot of books. And with the subsequent children, it was varied experiences and learning, each step of the way, what resources there were out there.
Taking a little break so I can tell you that this show is being brought to you by allaboutbreastfeeding.biz. Sound familiar to some of my regular listeners? If you have not been to the homepage, you will want to check it out so you can learn in detail about the ways in which I help and I connect with mothers. I would like to highlight the Breastfeeding Mothers Group. I call it the Before and After Mothers Group. I love joining soon-to-be moms in a group with new moms. You have so much to talk about and so much to share with each other. We're going to be meeting online for 1 hour once a week. How many times have you felt overwhelmed in your role as a new mom? How many times do you wish that you had a group of friends, of other moms that you could meet with that really get you? They really know what it's like to be a new mom. You are frequently experiencing emotions that are pretty much at both ends of the spectrum. You're feeling so happy and blessed to have a new baby, and at the same time, you have all of these other feelings, and sometimes you're afraid to share your thoughts with others. I mean, how would it look to tell others that you're having a difficult time keeping up with the demands of new motherhood and that you never expected it to be so hard? And for pregnant moms, you really want to be in this group because we will help you prepare for new motherhood. You will get real and honest answers from moms who are in the thick of new motherhood. There are lots of tips and suggestions they will wish someone had told them, and they are just waiting to share them with you. I will be facilitating the group to make sure we keep the conversation going, stay on task, and ensure that this is a judgment-free and safe place to share your feelings. So registration for this next group that is starting on June 20th, the registration opens today, Monday, May 1st, 2017, and it will close on May 12th, 2017. I like to keep the group small enough so that we can really get to know one another. Once we reach 10 people, the registration closes. We will meet for 6 weeks, and frequently, moms love this group so much, they just sign up for another 6 weeks with the same moms. So you really become close to each other. For more details on time and fees and registration info, just go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz. All right, let's get back to the show where Jenn picks up telling us how she became involved as a WIC peer counselor.
I just finished an interview with Laura Wilson, who's another IBCLC, and she also mentioned getting help and support from WIC, and we got into another part of the conversation, and I let it slide because we just moved on to something else. But you mentioned WIC again, and I wonder if you would just take a couple of minutes and talk to us a little bit about WIC with reference to mothers and children and breastfeeding, the support you got there, and then turns out that you became a counselor there. So, because some people might not know that WIC, which is wonderful, that it is available to some moms. And so can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Because that's really was my starting point into becoming an IBCLC was, I knew that I wanted to help other mothers and I knew that I wanted to be of support, but I also knew that I wanted to have that evidence-based knowledge because there's so many myths out there. So when I was at WIC one day, just some mom came up to me and just said, "Hi, I'm a peer counselor with WIC. I noticed you're nursing your baby. Do you have any questions or can I be of assistance?" And it kind of took me off guard, and I was like, okay, who are you? type situation. And she was like, well, I'm a WIC mom just like you. And to be a breastfeeding peer counselor, I have to be a WIC mom, or had been a WIC mom. And I have to have successfully breastfed my baby for at least 6 months or more. So I'm here to help you with any questions or concerns you have about your breastfeeding experience. And I thought that was just the coolest thing since sliced bread. I really, really did.
After you got over the, who are you?
Exactly, absolutely, because you're kind of like, in the WIC waiting room, anybody that's been on WIC before, it can be a little hectic and crazy, and
right.
So it's just kind of like, whoa. But no, so I ended up, while I was pregnant with my second son, I believe, was when I started going through the peer counselor training. Maybe I may have my timeline off a little bit. So I did, it's called Loving Support Breastfeeding Peer Counseling Training. I believe it's about 18 hours of training, and it's all evidence-based information. And the whole purpose is for WIC mothers to support other WIC mothers be successful in their breastfeeding experience. And quite honestly, that's where my heart has always been. And, I actually served as a WIC breastfeeding peer counselor coordinator in Brevard County for several years, developing the peer counseling program over there, because that population is so near and dear to my heart, because I was in that situation with my first two for quite a while. So, the WIC program is fantastic in the sense that, there's a lot of education provided by the nutritionist, but it's so powerful. That mom-to-mom support is so powerful. And being able to have breastfeeding peer counselors with WIC has really proven, statistically, and all the research behind it and all that to be just a great addition to the WIC program, because, moms can relate to other moms, and that's what they want. Sometimes, having kind of that white coat syndrome, having that doctor telling them what they can and can't do, or maybe a fear of asking questions, but somebody that's been in your shoes or that is in your shoes, a lot of times you can relate more to, you feel more open with. It's a great thing to have.
It's a wonderful experience. When I was a student of lactation, my wonderful mentor, Bonnie Jones, had a sister, Judy, who worked at WIC. And Judy lovingly allowed me to come and shadow her. I spent probably about a week's worth with her. And
wow.
I just got to, it was great as a student. I just got to see a bird's eye view of how everything with WIC worked. And I watched her work with the moms and the families with breastfeeding, and she did classes. It was a lot of education. Judy was just absolutely wonderful, and again, it opened up my eyes to another valuable resource for breastfeeding moms. And so I talk about WIC a lot, and any opportunity just like this, I like to highlight it. So thanks for sharing your experience with WIC.
Absolutely.
I'd like to talk about your first babe, who's a boy who's now 13, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so
I'm a teenager.
I know. Oh. Well, I don't know. My teenage boy was fun, and he was bookended with two girls. And actually, my oldest was fun. My middle was fun. And my husband and I were like, well, all that was all wrapped into my third. If she's listening, she knows she was a hard teenager for us. So we always say she made up for the other two being fairly easy. But I also like to share that she's definitely come around. She's a wonderful, mature, married woman now. But as a teenager, she definitely gave us a run for our money.
I'm sure that I have my eye on my 13-year-old we call him our Honest Abe. He's a very, very sweet child. Really takes on the big brother role very seriously, very giving, loving, caring. You hear so much about teenage years, so it makes me apprehensive, but
yes,
he's a great kid.
And the thing is like, all of them are great kids, not to scare you or anything.
Yes, absolutely.
But they all are great kids, which I think is what makes it so mind-blowing when they change and become someone that you don't even know anymore.
Right.
That's what really gets most parents, and why you hear us talk about some of our teenagers, because it's just like all of a sudden, who walked out the door and who came in instead?
Where's my baby?
Where's my baby? Yeah. Tell us what breastfeeding was like with your first babe. I know that you said you had a difficult labor. And so tell us a little bit about that. And I think it's really helpful for my audience to hear all those lovely details that I think a lot of people just gloss around, which is part of the reason why pregnant moms and new moms just assume that you give birth, the baby latches on, and you can, a few days later be walking around holding your baby and multitasking and, whisking a cake or something. And because so many people don't really get to see moms breastfeed, particularly in the early days when we are in this huge learning curve, there are challenges we're trying to figure out. And that's very, very normal for most of us. Even when breastfeeding is going well, there's still, you just kind of have to figure out how you're kind of working together with your baby and the whole, supporting and pillow thing and sleep and all that. And so they don't get to really hear the stuff that happens, and especially in those first couple of weeks, couple of months. So I like to really enlighten my audience because I think it helps motivate them to seek references and help in groups before they've had their baby and do some education so that they have those support people in place. If when they have their baby, they're struggling, they don't have to first start to look and figure out, and or that they're also not just so totally blown away for them if it is hard and challenges, if all they have in their head is that this is a natural thing to do. So tell us about your experience.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. And I agree with you, seeking that support and education and guidance prior to the baby being born is so very, very important. And just reading the books like I did with my first, I didn't have that to lean back on. So, yes, it was a long, very long, difficult labor. Went in on a Thursday and he wasn't born until a Saturday.
Well, that is a long labor.
A very long labor. But, I had read enough to know, okay, his lips need to look flanged and this is what you need to hold him like this. And according to everything I had read, it looked right. It didn't necessarily feel right, but I didn't get any assistance in the hospital with breastfeeding. I was just asked, is he nursing? And I said yes, and that was about it. But once we got home, he would literally nurse for hours and hours and hours on end. And I know as a lactation consultant myself, and I'm sure as you are, you have clients that say, oh, they nurse all the time. And yes, I understand that, babies, newborns do need to nurse frequently. But in this case, he would literally 24/7 literally be attached to the breast. I would watch an entire 2-hour movie and he would be nursing, and then he'd pull off screaming and go right back on. I was cracked. I was bleeding. I was exhausted. I went, days without a shower, not eating myself. Again, since I didn't go to any support groups and I didn't know about La Leche League and I didn't know any better, I thought it was just natural and it should just come, that I didn't know I was doing, that something was not right. And what really enabled me to understand that was we went for his follow-up pediatric appointment. And they said, okay, well, are you breastfeeding or bottle feeding? I said, well, I'm breastfeeding. And she goes, oh, he's down a lot from his birth weight. And my goodness, he looks pretty jaundiced. And I was just kind of confused. I said, well, his latch is right. And I read all these books and I called all these hotlines and they said, oh, well, newborns can cluster feed. And I just figured that's what he was doing, was just cluster feeding. And I said, well, how long should he be breastfeeding at once? And she said, well, about maybe 15 minutes or so, and I just started bawling. I said, no, you don't understand. He's on for hours and hours and hours at a time. And I said, but his lips are flanged like the fishy, like I read in the book. And she goes, I really think you need to see our IBCLC that's here in the office. That same day, thankfully, I went in for a full breastfeeding assessment. And we found out that actually the reason why that he was on for hours and hours and hours was because it was like his tongue was at the roof of his mouth, and it was almost as if, the analogy she used, as drinking through a straw that's squished. So even though it looked right from the outside, there were signs that indicated that something wasn't right. So, the pain, the bleeding, the painful nipples, the weight loss, the exacerbated jaundice levels. she really helped me turn that corner. She gave me, a care plan to follow.
We are going to end this story right here and pick it back up next week, where in part 2, Jenn continues her story, telling us the pivotal moment that sent her on a different career path. Until then, bye-bye.